If your product owner loads up the backlog with 100 items in it, in every sprint, you just take what's at the top of the list, work through it the best you can. In the next sprint, it's just whatever's lower down the list. There's no agility in that. You're not changing the order of what's built. And that is not Agile software development. That is Waterfall. Have you ever been on a Scrum team and felt like this is supposed to be Agile? This feels like the most constrained, strict, and fixed thing I've ever worked with. Well, today I want to talk to you about how the backlog used on most Scrum projects is actually one of the best things you can look at to try to figure out, is my team really even Agile? Or is this actually a whole company and a whole team set up to do Waterfall, but they're using Scrum and it's actually making the project worse? The whole purpose of a backlog is to deliver a software product and get feedback from customers every time you release a sprint and change the backlog. So if there's no desire or budget to actually change the project and release the work at the end of the sprint, the backlog actually hurts you more than it helps you. So with that being said, let me help you out by sharing 7 reasons that your Scrum backlog may actually be an indication that you should be using a waterfall project. The first reason your project may be better off being waterfall, if you look at how you're using the backlog, is if the features that are designed and in the backlog have no usage metrics. What usage metrics are is they're basically information that the software gathers as people use the feature that tells the business if the feature is getting the results that it was intended to. If you build a feature and the whole idea of that feature is to drive sales or increase productivity or reduce costs, if you don't actually have something in the software for that feature that records what people are doing, you're basically guessing whether that feature actually gave you what you hoped it would. The second way you can tell right away if a company is using a backlog in a Scrum project and they're not really set up to be Agile is if they're not actually releasing the software at the end of each sprint. Way back when Waterfall was common in the 90s and before, we would build software in increments and have status reports very similar to how we do Scrum, but we wouldn't try releasing the product until all the code was built. And if you're on a Scrum project and you're building sprints worth of work, but at the end of each sprint, that code doesn't actually go out to your customer, that's not setting you up for agility because you're not actually getting a return on investment in what you built until the whole product's built, which is the whole reason Agile was come up with. And you also have no insight into how well you're doing. The third way you can tell if your team's not really set up to be Agile and how they're using the backlog is if the backlog items are never reordered before each sprint. If your product owner loads up the backlog with 100 items in it, let's say, in every sprint, you just take what's at the top of the list, work through it the best you can. In the next sprint, it's just whatever's lower down the list. There's no agility in that. You're not changing the order of what's built. You're just executing a plan from top to bottom that the product owner and the business came up with. And that is not Agile software development. That is Waterfall. The fourth way you can tell that your team is not actually benefiting from any agility in how they're using the backlog is if features are never removed from the backlog. If you are releasing features at the end of every sprint, and those have metrics included in them, and you can tell how customers are using them, if you release a feature to your customer and you find out it's not getting you the business results you'd hoped, unless you can find a way to redesign it, the best thing to do is remove it from the code base. It's extra code you don't want to have hanging around, and the worst thing you want to do is keep building on new things on top of a feature that's not even giving you any value. It's just continued waste on the project. The fifth way you can tell if your team's really set up to do Agile development through how they use the backlog is if no new features are ever added after a release based on feedback. There's ideas that the business has for what the product needs to do to be accepted by the customer, but there's also ideas in the customer's head that the team doesn't know until they get feedback on what they're releasing. And if your team's never actually getting that feedback from the customer, they can add features till the cows come home, but if they're never the features the customer wants, they're not going to accept the product. product. The sixth way you can tell right away if your team's really agile or if they're just using the backlog in a truly waterfall fixed way is if there's estimates and acceptance criteria on all the user stories. If you've started a Scrum project before, and before anybody gets started, the business asks you as a developer or anybody on the team to just take a rough estimate at all the user stories, that is a sign that they're trying to estimate the cost of the entire project, not taking into account at all any changes based on customer feedback or features being used differently than they expected. And that's not agile software development. And the seventh way you can tell right away if your team is really getting any agility from how they use the product backlog is if they're measuring success by the productivity of the development team and not by the business outcomes of what's being released. If all the management is doing is measuring sprint to sprint how fast developers are getting work done, but they don't have corresponding metrics about how the product's being used in production from those changes, they're basically delaying business results and finding out if they did the right thing. So the risk is way higher to the business because they're investing over and over and over and over again, measuring developers thinking, well, we're on track, we're building the right thing. And a big benefit to agile development is to be able to just stop building stuff that you've already found isn't actually getting you results. So with all that being said, if you're looking at how your team is using the backlog and based on what I just shared with you, you're thinking, we're nowhere near agile. Are there some things you can do to at least get some of the benefit of business agility? Absolutely. And so let me give you 7 things that you can do to improve the business agility of how your team's using the backlog. The first thing you can do to get actual business agility from the backlog is build usage metrics into every feature. The product owner should be working with the developers not to just figure out the acceptance criteria for how the feature is going to be built, but how are they going to measure once that feature goes out the door and gets in front of some customers, whether it's actually doing anything that's getting them closer to the business impact that they'd hoped. Now, this takes a lot of creativity and it takes a lot of understanding the business. And sometimes you can't make a decision based on one feature. You need to collect information from a few different features. But I find when I work with a team and they spend a lot of effort on estimating and they keep putting features out there, but they don't actually have any data, some empirical evidence that tells them they're moving in the right direction, all the emphasis on the project gets to be on measuring productivity, and nobody even knows if what's being built is actually even helping the customer. The second thing you can do to actually get business agility out of your backlog is to release every sprint's work. You need to build a continuous delivery pipeline. I'm going to talk about this more down the road, but basically you need to have an automated build, test, and release process that you can kick off anytime. All the technologies that are available to do this today are very mature. You can put controls on them to say, developers can have their code released into a developer environment every time they check the code in. The QA department are the only ones who are permitted to pull those builds into the QA environment, and that's automated. The business itself are the only ones that are allowed to pull into the production environment, and they can often have to do like dual approvals with some key operations personnel. But if you can't get a sprint's work in front of the customer, you're not going to be able to get feedback. You're not going to be able to measure data. And every sprint is basically just plowing along work that was already planned. There is absolutely nothing agile about that whatsoever. The third thing you can do to actually start to get some business agility from how you use a backlog on a Scrum project is to actually measure the impact of the sprint's features you just released before you start building onto them. If your team just built a feature, let's say, that allows customers to rate the quality of an article they've read, let's say it's like a reading platform or something like that, before your team starts to invest in more features in future sprints that enhance the rating and review system, find out if customers are even bothering starting to use it and actually get some feedback first. Teams worry about wasting money so much because they're focused on the estimates and whether the budget is going to go over, but they often don't look at how much money is wasted building stuff nobody even uses. So if you're a product manager out there or a scrum master and your team is working hard to release a feature, the worst thing you can do if you want business agility is to have the sprint right after it make more investment in that feature when you haven't even gathered any usage metrics from your customer yet, or feedback even, to find out if you're even moving in the right direction. The fourth thing you can do to actually get some business agility out of the backlog is to never reprioritize the backlog unless you've got enough information to make an empirical decision. What I mean by this is, if you're looking at how customers are using the product and you just have a gut feel that maybe the priority of the features in the backlog aren't what they should be, it's much better if you've got actual hard data. People can give a lot of feedback on software products that is well-intentioned, but it's misguided, and it's not even fully honest in how they're using it. The fifth thing you can do if you want to actually be agile and get some agility out of the backlog is remove features that aren't turning out to be as valuable as people hoped. If a team's building a feature and they release it to production, and there's usage metrics in there, and they find that that feature is not being used as much as they'd hoped, you could try to figure out, is that feature maybe designed in a way that's not getting the results we want? And in the next sprint, we need to just redesign that feature and try a different approach. But let's say that isn't possible, or you've redesigned it a couple times and it's still not getting you the business results you want. The best thing you can do is just remove it as soon as possible and not carry the debt of just having code in there that's really adding no value to the customer. The sixth thing you can do if you really want to get business agility out of how your team's using a backlog is have the management commit to business outcomes and not percentage complete of a project. Remember, the whole idea behind Agile is, as a team, we're having the humility to know we may not know all the things our customer needs for this project to be successful until we release it to them and adapt it and make changes. The definition of Agile is literally the ability to adapt to change. So if you focus the development team on hitting a deadline for, let's say, multiple sprints and 100 user stories worth of work, if they deliver those features and they find out way later after they've exhausted their budget that there's some things they need to change, now they have to ask for extra budget just to deliver what they could have delivered much earlier if they would have started releasing their ideas earlier and gotten feedback and been able to actually take action on it. And the seventh thing you can do if you really want to get business agility out of your backlog is to remove dependencies on other teams and use cross-functional teams. What I mean by this is, in Agile backlogs, we don't have an easy way to see dependencies between people. Now, I know if you look at Jira and some of these products like that out there, they've slowly added support for dependencies over the years. But remember, Jira's business model is to sell a software product. Even if project managers who don't understand Agile development come to them and go, we got to have dependencies, they're going to add those if that means they can sell more of the product. That doesn't mean that their purpose in life is to actually help the business be successful and the team be agile and deliver the right product. It just means they have to give whoever's making the buying decisions comfort around the product. So if you're on a project and there's like 8 teams involved and they all have dependencies and everything has to happen in order, that's completely eliminating the ability to be agile, because think about it. If one team releases their changes, gets feedback, and wants to change, now they're changing the order of their own backlog, their own work, and that's going to have ripple effects through every other team they're dependent on. Agile development was designed to be done by a single cross-functional team. The ops people are part of it that need to be there. The UX people that need to be part of it are there. The product owner is dedicated to it. The developers are not working on 2 to 3 other projects. They're only working on that project. And the idea is they're producing work at a sustainable pace, driven by data and driven by feedback, not driven by predicted roadmaps. So I hope that helped a little bit. You may be thinking right now, dude, what you're talking about is so far removed from how we're using a backlog. I don't think anybody does this. People do use backlogs for feedback. They do reprioritize them. They do add new features each sprint. But these are teams that have recognized that the value of feedback and adapting the product is greater than the value of a false promise of some sort of cost of the project if what turns out to be delivered is the wrong product and the whole business tanks because of it. So are you on a team that claims to be agile, but when you think back on how the backlog's being used, none of it matches the things I'm talking about in this video? Leave me some comments about why people have said that the things I'm talking about can't work, and maybe some of the things you're facing, because I really think I can help you a lot more if I understand some of the common objections and I can speak directly to how I've overcome those with other people. Or if they're new ones I've never heard before, I can try to figure out a good way for you to sell the benefits of that to them. So until next time, thanks.